My son called me a burden in front of 22 relatives at Thanksgiving. Not in anger. Not in a private argument where people say things they regret. He said it while carving turkey in my own dining room, with one hand on the electric knife and the other gesturing toward me like I was an old couch nobody knew how to throw away. "Dad's becoming a burden," Mark said. "We all know it. We're just the only ones brave enough to say it." The room went quiet for half a second. Then my daughter Elaine looked down at her wine glass and said, "Assisted living isn't a punishment. It would free up the house for what the family actually needs." The house. My house. The one my wife, Ruth, and I bought in 1979. The one where Mark learned to ride a bike in the driveway and Elaine broke the kitchen window with a softball. The one I paid off 3 years early by working tax season after tax season until my eyes burned. I was 74 years old, a retired accountant, and apparently I had become furniture in my own life. 48 hours later, Mark stood on my porch in a wool coat he couldn't afford, holding a folder and smiling like Thanksgiving had never happened. "Dad," he said, "we need one little signature from you." That was the moment I knew Ruth had been right. She had seen this coming before she died. Let me back up. My wife passed away 6 years ago. After that, my kids started treating me like a project. Not a person. A project. At first, it sounded caring. "Dad, you shouldn't drive at night." "Dad, let me look at those bank statements." "Dad, the stairs are getting dangerous." Some of it was reasonable. I'm not a stubborn old fool. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I do forget names sometimes. But I still managed my own bills, cooked for myself, kept my lawn decent, and volunteered twice a month helping seniors file tax paperwork. I was not helpless. Mark and Elaine just found it useful to talk as if I were. Thanksgiving was supposed to be easy that year. Elaine insisted on hosting it at my house because, according to her, Mom would have wanted everyone together. That was always how they got me. Mom would have wanted. Ruth would have wanted family at the table. Ruth would have wanted the grandkids to have memories. Ruth would have wanted me not to make things difficult. So I paid for the groceries. I let Elaine take over the kitchen. I let Mark rearrange the living room. I ignored it when Elaine's husband moved Ruth's framed photo from the mantel because it was kind of sad for the holiday vibe. But at dinner, things turned. It started with my grandson asking if I still did taxes. "I help a little at the senior center," I said. Mark laughed. "Dad still thinks people need paper ledgers." Elaine added, "He does better when things are simple." I looked at her. "I managed corporate accounts for 38 years. Years ago," she said gently, like she was patting a dog. "That was years ago." Then Mark carved the turkey and gave his little speech about burdens. My niece Sandra, Ruth's sister's girl, looked horrified. My brother-in-law coughed into his napkin. Nobody spoke up. That part hurt almost as much as what my kids said. Elaine kept going. "We've been researching places, Dad. Nice places. Assisted living with meals and activities. You'd make friends. I have friends. You have old tax clients and the mailman," Mark said. A few people laughed because they thought they were supposed to. I sat there with mashed potatoes cooling on my plate, while my children discussed my removal from my home like a budget item. Then Elaine said the part one never forgot. "Honestly, Dad, the house is wasted on one person. The whole family could benefit if we handled this correctly." Handled this. Not helped me. Handled this. I stood up slowly. "I'm going to get some air." Mark didn't even look at me. "Don't wander too far." I walked into the kitchen. And that's where the first piece of luck happened. A year earlier, after a package theft, my grandson had installed a small security camera above the kitchen cabinet facing the back door. It also caught half the kitchen table and, depending on volume, recorded audio from the dining room. Nobody remembered it was there. I did. I made a cup of coffee I didn't want and stood under that camera while my children kept talking. Mark said, "If we can get him to sign before New Year's, the trust distribution can happen early." Elaine said, The attorney said we need his acknowledgement. Not full approval. Just acknowledgement, Mark replied. He'll sign if we make it sound like care planning. Elaine lowered her voice. And if he refuses? Mark said. Then we push harder. He can't keep that house hostage forever. I stayed in the kitchen until my hands stopped shaking. I didn't confront them that night. I didn't make a speech. I didn't throw anyone out. I learned a long time ago that emotional people make bad accountants. And I had spent my life being a very good accountant. The next morning, I downloaded the camera footage to a flash drive. Then I called my attorney, Paul Levin. Paul had handled Ruth's estate, our family trust, and every document my children thought they understood because they had skimmed one email 6 years ago. He answered with, Walter, I assume this is about Thanksgiving. That startled me. How did you know? He sighed. Mark called my office this morning asking about early distribution procedures. Of course he did. I went to Paul's office that afternoon. He watched the kitchen footage in silence. When Mark said, He can't keep that house hostage forever, Paul paused the video and took off his glasses. Well, he said, that makes things clearer. Can they force me into assisted living? No. Can they force the trust distribution? Also no. But they can make noise. And they were clearly preparing to pressure you. Then Paul pulled out the trust documents. Ruth had insisted on a protection clause. I remembered signing it, but at the time I thought it was just legal padding. It said that any beneficiary who attempted to coerce, financially pressure, medically misrepresent, or neglect the grantor for the purpose of accelerating inheritance could have their distribution delayed, restricted, or converted to conditional payments. I read the sentence twice. Paul said, Ruth wanted that clause. I looked down at the page. She never told me. She said you'd argue that the children would never do that. That was Ruth. Still protecting me from my own optimism. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Mark showed up with the folder. Dad, we've all been thinking, he said. We? Me and Elaine. This doesn't have to be unpleasant. What doesn't? He stepped inside without being invited and laid the folder on the hall table. It's just an acknowledgement. It says we've discussed future care planning as a family. I opened the folder. It was not just care planning. It referenced early trust review, property transition options, and preliminary consent to beneficiary consultation. Accountant or not, I knew foggy language when I saw it. I looked at Mark. Did Paul draft this? His eyes flickered. It's standard. That wasn't my question. He sighed. Dad, don't be difficult. This is exactly what we were talking about. You can't manage everything forever. Then came the soft voice. You don't want Elaine and me fighting after you're gone, do you? That was the false kindness. The little hook under the worm. For a second, I almost wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe Thanksgiving had been clumsy concern. I wanted to believe my children were scared, not greedy. So I gave him one chance. Mark, I said, if this is about my care, we can schedule a meeting with Paul, my doctor, and both of you. Everything transparent. His face hardened. You always have to control everything. No. I just like reading before signing. He snatched the folder back. You know what your problem is? You think because you paid for this house, everybody has to beg. I said, no one has to beg. They do have to ask. He left angry. Elaine came the next day with muffins. That was how I knew they were worried. She set them on the counter and smiled too brightly. Dad, Mark can be blunt. But he loves you. He called me a burden. She winced. He said you were becoming one. Thank you for clarifying. She sat across from me and reached for my hand. I let her take it. We're trying to protect your dignity. My dignity was sitting at that table when you discussed moving me out of my house. Her eyes filled with tears. Elaine had always been able to cry on command. As a child, it was charming. At 51, it was strategy. If Mom were here, she'd want us to help you. I pulled my hand back. If your mother were here, none of you would have dared say what you said. That finally shut her up. The legal reveal happened 3 weeks later in Paul's conference room. Mark and Elaine arrived expecting a negotiation. Mark wore his serious business face. Elaine brought a binder labeled Dad Care Options, as if branding my removal made it loving. Paul had invited Sandra too, at my request. She was not a beneficiary, but she had been at Thanksgiving, and she was the only relative who had called me afterward to say, "Uncle Walter, that was wrong." Paul began calmly. "Walter has reviewed the family trust and has decided not to authorize early distribution." Mark leaned forward. "That's unreasonable. We're not asking for all of it." Paul continued. "Additionally, based on documented attempts to pressure Walter regarding his home and assets, he has elected to activate the Beneficiary Protection Clause." Elaine blinked. "The what?" Paul slid copies across the table. Mark read faster than Elaine. His face changed first. "This is ridiculous," he said. Paul said, "It is binding." I placed the flash drive on the table. "There is also audio from Thanksgiving," Elaine whispered. "You recorded us?" "No," I said. "The kitchen camera recorded people speaking loudly in my house." Paul did not play the whole thing. He played enough. Mark's voice filled the room. "He can't keep that house hostage forever." Elaine's voice followed. "If he refuses?" "Then Mark." "Then we push harder." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Sandra looked at my children like she had never seen them before. Elaine started crying for real this time. Mark turned on me. "You're punishing your own kids." "No," I said. "I'm protecting an old man from being pushed out of his home." "You're not some helpless old man." "Exactly." That was the first honest thing he had said in weeks, and he didn't even realize it. The trust didn't disinherit them completely. I didn't want that. I'm not pretending I stopped loving my children. Love doesn't shut off because people disappoint you. But consequences matter. Their lump sum inheritance was converted into conditional distributions over time. No early access. No control over my home. No authority over my care unless I personally granted it later. Any attempt to pressure me again would suspend payments further. Mark was furious because he had counted on that money to cover a business loan he'd personally guaranteed. Elaine was furious because she had already planned renovations to my house in her head. That was their problem. Not mine. The house stayed mine. My care decisions stayed mine. My accounts stayed mine. And then I did something Ruth would have loved. I used part of the trust's charitable allowance to start the Ruth Bennett Senior Dignity Fund at the local community foundation. Not huge. I'm not a millionaire. But enough to help seniors with legal consultations, emergency housing support, and financial abuse prevention. The first grant paid for an attorney for an 82-year-old woman whose nephew had been trying to get her to sign over her condo. When I heard that, I sat in my kitchen and cried for the first time since Thanksgiving. Not because I was sad. Because something ugly had turned useful. Mark and Elaine still call occasionally. The conversations are polite and short. They don't mention assisted living anymore. They don't mention early distribution. They definitely don't mention Thanksgiving. Sandra comes by every Sunday now with soup or gossip or both. My grandson installed 2 new cameras, with my permission this time. He also asked me to teach him how to balance a checkbook, which made me laugh harder than I had in months. I am 74. I have bad knees. I occasionally forget why I walked into a room. But I am not a burden. I am the man who built this house, balanced the books, buried the love of my life, and still had enough sense to read the fine print. My children thought inheritance was something they could hurry along by making me feel small. They forgot who taught them math. And in the end, the numbers worked out exactly the way they should.